WCNC Charlotte. This is Flashpoint, where power and politics collide, and the tough questions get asked and answered.
Hey folks, welcome to Flashpoint here inside the WCNC app. I'm Ben Thompson, joined by Julie Kay. Good to see you. A big week coming up for folks down in South Carolina. We have got the Tuesday primary, although we already know that they've seen record turnout in early voting.
So much going on, my goodness. Also, guys, we're not doing Charlotte City Council.
Hey,
Huge.
That's notable,
That's
right?
a win
That's
in my
right.
book.
That's right. That's right.
But just so much going on. I mean, between the redistricting push at the last minute and then the redistricting flop right after that, and now we're back to square one with really like a full list of gubernatorial candidates on this primary for both sides.
Packed. It's crowded. Yeah.
It's crowded. So it's going to be really interesting. It'll be interesting to see how President Trump's endorsement of Pamela Yvette plays out. So
in these circumstances, there is one person I always like to talk to, and he joins us now this morning. Joining us now is Scott Huffman, friend of the program and professor of politics at Winthrop University. Professor, good as always to see you.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so primary is Tuesday in South Carolina, and you're sort of our go-to person when it comes to South Carolina politics. And so lay it out for us, set the stage. We've seen record numbers in early voting. Is that because you think voters are engaged, or is there something else in play?
Well, the main reason we're seeing a spike in early voting has to do with the attempt at redistricting. A lot of folks, especially Democrats, who do early vote but don't necessarily do it the first day, and Democrats in general turn out at a lower rate than Republicans. But the incredible spike in early voting was so that if they did redistricting, they would have to look at the public and say, we're throwing out thousands and thousands of votes that have been cast, and that's a tough thing to sell. So again, the South Carolina Senate not up for re-election this year, so they're not going to be primaried by somebody who is more pro-Trump. Ended up spiking the redistricting, but the big surge in early voting, I think, can mostly be attributed to that.
I want to talk more about redistricting in just a second because it did sort of serve as a backdrop to all of this in the last few weeks because it was sort of happening simultaneously. But let's talk about the race. Still, the race is on the ballot on Tuesday. Handicap the governor's race for us.
Well, Pamela Yvette was already ahead in most of the polls. Who was in second place was sort of jumping back and forth. The big question is exactly who shows up. So in general, the people that show up are the most passionate Republicans, the furthest right, the most America First, most MAGA these days. So you have to appeal to that. Now, 80% of potential Republican primary voters had already said Donald Trump's endorsement will mean a lot to me. So that really puts Pamela Yvette, who is already ahead of the polls, to the forefront. However, among the chattering class, the politicos, there's a lot of talk about was there quid pro quo. Now, her campaign will obviously deny it, as they should, but no one can deny it looks like there might have been a bargain, because we know that Henry McMaster, first in the state to first statewide elected official to endorse Trump in his run for presidency, they are very close. And then McMaster calls back the legislature for a session to try redistricting, and then Trump endorses McMaster's endorsed candidate, and magically is McMaster's son supposed to be her lieutenant governor running mate. So this smacks of quid pro quo. Whether it is or not becomes irrelevant, because appearances are more important than reality. And will that impact the whether or not the Trump endorsement makes the big difference? She's still ahead in the polls, though.
Yeah. Per usual, you have about 12 different storylines going on in a South Carolina race. Let's say Yvette does walk away with a win on Tuesday. What's that mean? And you've got several other really big names running for this one seat. What happens to the Nancy Maces of the world?
Well, Nancy Mace is young enough to get into politics elsewhere. She gave up her seat If she had gotten the nomination, she would have had to give up her seat anyway. You can't run for governor and run for another race as well. Ralph Norman resigned his seat. Ralph is on the cusp of he might retire, he might not. He is an incredibly wealthy developer from the York County part of the 5th District. So I'm not sure what he's going to do. He may choose to run again for governor. Who knows? He could hang around for Senate. I think Nancy Mace might be looking at what races she could jump in the future. The big question is, how will the Republican Party feel about her, given the grenade she has thrown in this race to try and get to the forefront of the pack?
What do you think is the impact of Trump being relatively silent on Nancy Mace?
Well, if he had come out strongly denouncing her, that really would have put her in the basement early on. Now, people in the know in South Carolina politics, Republicans who are the leaders of the county political parties, know full well that she denounced Trump and denounced the January 6th riot, domestic terrorism, by the literal definition of that term. So there was already some bad feelings, and she tried to come back from that, make an announcement in front of Trump Tower. Then she more recently pushed for the release of the Epstein files. And it's harder for the rank and file Republican to say, hey, let's punish her for that, because they had been saying the same thing before the election. However, Trump has said, I don't want this, and has sort of ostracized Nancy Mace, but not come out speaking directly against her.
Yeah, it's been interesting to see. You try to pin down Nancy Mace, and it seems like every time she comes up in the news, it surprises me in some way or the other, because it might not be what I expected.
She knows how to make a headline.
She knows how to make a headline very, very well. You mentioned it earlier, the failed attempt at redistricting, sort of the backdrop of all of this that's been going on, all these races, all these contests, an attempt endorsed by the president and the governor to redraw the state's 7 congressional districts, taking support from Jim Clyburn in his district and making that another solid Republican congressional seat. They did this within days before the start of early voting, creating the problem. Now, do you think that this was, it failed because there was not support for it, or because, by just about all accounts, this was horribly timed?
Well, it was horribly timed. It was not a good thing for South Carolina. It was a good thing for national strategy, but one of the reasons it was not good for South Carolina was because of the timing. So again, the only way the Senate was able to put a stop to it is because they are not up for re-election. A lot of the members of the House, or all of the members of the House, were up for re-election, but the redistricting in South Carolina would have made it so that it could have been 5-2 according to some in the legislature. It wouldn't have. It would have become 7-0. But the truth of the matter is, another thing it would have done would make those 2 districts more competitive. So the Republican would have won, but by a little less. But the down ticket races could have been heavily affected. If you have greater Democratic turnout, then a school board seat that might have otherwise gone to a Republican could go to a Democrat. A county council seat that would have otherwise gone to a Republican might go to a Democrat. So it could have a lot of down ticket implications. Plus the fact military ballots were not just sent out, but already started coming in. You would have had to look at the public and say, we're throwing out the ballots of our soldiers.
Well, so just for a point of clarification, that is what would have happened here. If they had passed this after, early voting had started, they would have had to scrap potentially thousands of ballots.
Yes, the South Carolina Election Commission specifically said that they would have to be tossed out. There would be an attempt at getting information out about what new district you were in, about whether or not you had to come back and vote. it would have been an absolute mess. People would have had no idea who their candidate was. You would have had cities like Spartanburg split up into multiple districts. York County would have been split up with Fort Mill being in a different district and in a district over with Dillon. So there are no really communities of interest in it at all. And again, the Republican representation from South Carolina is so solid. They are already gerrymandered districts, and one district in South Carolina was generally not seen as a tipping point until the redistricting wars across the country weren't leaning as much Republican as they expected them to when they lit the fuse on that.
I would assume that this is not over. It's over for now, this cycle, but I assume this will be addressed again and brought back up.
Oh yeah, in South Carolina, definitely before the next set of elections. Part of it depends on the legacy of Trump in the Republican Party. He is completely in control of the party now, but we have just seen in Congress people who are no longer afraid of their primaries actually pushing back against Trump on a few things, like the war in Iran and a few other things. So how much control Trump can exert over what happens in 2028, meaning pushing for new redistricting before that congressional race, that remains to be seen. And if he names a successor, an heir apparent, what will they push for? So yeah, it's still in the realm of possibility before we get to the 2028 elections.
And I think with this kind of shift within the federal government of some Republicans willing to step out a bit, I think it'll be really interesting to see how many of these Trump-endorsed candidates, how they do as we're coming up on multiple elections, not just in South Carolina, but across the country.
Well, you know, the Trump-endorsed candidates, with the exception of, well, you know, just this last week, have done incredibly well in the primaries. So a Trump endorsement was gold. It's still pretty darn shiny in the Republican primary, but you're going to have these strong MAGA Republicans going into the general election at a time when Trump's approval rating in the general population is at one of its lowest ever. People are upset about the economy. They are upset about gas prices. And even if the war in Iran ends, the cost of oil goes down, there has been such a disruption in the supply chains that the impact on inflation for groceries and goods will continue through Election Day, and that could really hurt Republicans, especially Republicans who have welded their wagon to the Trump train.
And you give me the perfect segue for that because I want to talk about the Winthrop poll. You're the man behind it. It comes out several times a year, gives us a good snapshot about what the people in South Carolina are thinking. One of the more eye-opening stats, and there was actually a couple of them, 2/3 of respondents say that paying for groceries is difficult. 72%, I think, said a week of vacation is out of reach for them. 60% said going out to dinner is unaffordable. Those are as kitchen table issues can be, as visceral political issues can be. But do you foresee that really having an electoral impact at the ballot box? Is that going to change anything for people?
If it continues, it will have an impact at the ballot box. Now, in South Carolina, it just might eat into the margin by which the Republican wins. But that sentiment is seen across the entire country. And people do vote their pocketbook. Now, sometimes that means voting their personal kitchen table, and that's probably what's going to be happening this time. Other times, they're what's called sociotropic voters, meaning regardless of how they're doing, they kind of vote the national economy, whether things are going good or bad. That was more in the past. With recent inflation, people are feeling it themselves, and they are voting based on their own personal economic interests. And that is going down for most people. But we have a K-shaped economy right now, which means some sectors of the economy are actually growing, but other sectors are diving down. And the same thing is true among people. There are certain sectors, and it's the wealthier, who are actually doing quite well. But lower income folks are being hit harder and harder. Their wages aren't keeping up with inflation. So while one group may be reaping benefits from the economy, another group is actually getting it much worse. So that will definitely play into the next election cycle that we have coming up.
Yeah, so fast forward to, say, the November election. The situation's not changed. The dynamic, these numbers say, are about the same as they are right now. Do you posit that these folks in South Carolina, I mean, are they all of a sudden going to become wild liberals who are voting for Democrats, or more, are they just going to not go and they're going to sit out? I mean, what does that look like when they actually go vote?
Well, again, we have to go back to how gerrymandered South Carolina is. So if you look at our state legislative districts, they are so incredibly gerrymandered that in the last legislative cycle, over 50% of state Senate seats had no opposition in the general election. Wow. And over 60% of the state House seats had no opposition in the general election. So that's how incredibly gerrymandered they are. So even if we did have a bumper crop of liberals in South Carolina, which will not happen, you are not going to see Republicans turned out of office, and the Democratic seats, what few there are gerrymandered as well. So we will perhaps see some impact down ticket, but when I say down ticket, I mean below the legislative South Carolina State House level. You're going to see it potentially locally, but again, even county council districts are incredibly gerrymandered in South Carolina. So the impact in South Carolina will not be as big as the impact we will see in congressional seats around the country.
We know the U.S. Supreme Court is currently considering birthright citizenship. The president pushing a new interpretation, or might be old to some people, but a less than traditional interpretation of it. Your response is 84% said that if you are born in the U.S. to legal immigrants, you should be considered a U.S. citizen. It's 84%. It's sizable, but there's still a sizable group of people that say, no, that's not necessarily the case.
Right, even if you're born to completely legal immigrants. And so those folks are kind of the America First part of the Republican Party, but there are a lot of Democrats who are saying, hey, they shouldn't be citizens as well. Now, again, the overwhelming majority say they should be citizens. But that gap between, hey, people born to U.S. citizens should be, natural-born U.S. citizens should be citizens as well, and the ones who are born to legal immigrants, that gap is very telling about what it means to be American. And again, birthright citizenship cases in the past have set the precedent that you're born here, it doesn't matter, no matter what your parents are like. However, cases are overturned. So this is not a slam dunk for any side, and nothing is a slam dunk for any side with this current court.
And perhaps precedent is no longer precedent. Something else, less than half of respondents think having diverse races, ethnic groups, nationalities make the U.S. or South Carolina a better place.
Right, and again, we have been called historically the melting pot. Give me you're tired, you're poor, you're hungry. That's from the poem The Great Colossus, which is at the Statue of Liberty. That is not really the feeling of a lot of people anymore. A lot of folks say, hey, if you're going to come to America, you need to adopt American culture, which begs the question, what is American culture? And number one, for a lot of people, that's, hey, you better learn to speak English. You better assimilate to our culture. And again, as someone born and raised in the South, my question is, what culture do you mean? Because I would prefer people learn to say y'all, speak with a beautiful lilt, and make casserole dishes for church picnics. But what culture is means different things to different people. And when people are answering this question, for a lot of them, it's just a proxy for I don't want minorities coming in. I don't like immigrants in general. And so that question and how people answer it can be very telling.
I'm going to offer my endorsement for the casserole.
Yeah, right?
I would like to.
I'm always down for a
To
casserole.
second that.
Yeah.
I thought what was interesting too is one of the most mixed responses you got kind of ties back to something you said earlier about what the economy is going to look like going forward. It seems like there wasn't a strong majority of whether people thought it was going to be better, worse, the same. It was kind of all over the place.
Yeah, uncertainty also drives people's votes quite strongly. If they don't feel that they're on solid ground, if they don't know what's going to happen, that's usually a problem for the party in power. And of course, nationally, that's the Republicans. They hold, both the Senate and the House. They hold the presidency, and Republican nominees hold the power in the Supreme Court. So when the economy is bad, it tends to hurt the party in power. When there is uncertainty, that also tends to hurt the party in power. So a lack of clarity about where the economy is going can hurt the Republicans, and they need to take control of the messaging about that if they want to prevent that uncertainty from having a bigger impact than it already is.
If you're in the South for any time at all, every few years, the issue of Confederate monuments comes up in some form or another, whether you're in North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, Georgia, Alabama. 31% said Confederate monuments should be left alone. Just leave them as is. A little more than that said, you know what, they should come with some sort of historical marker to say, give it a little context of what they are, the history behind it. Have those numbers changed at all over the years you've been doing this poll, or is that pretty consistent?
That's been pretty consistent. There are a few things that you can look at and see consistent. The majority of people do not want to just leave them alone. They want to pick one of the other options, move it to a museum, get rid of it completely, put a plaque for context, but not leave it alone. The other thing that's been a trend is you expect a big difference between blacks and whites when it comes to attitudes towards Confederate monuments, and you do see a big gap. But there's a bigger gap between Republicans and Democrats. So this has become an identity issue for Republicans and white conservatives. And of course, that brings back interesting history. White conservatives in the South were in the Democratic Party during the Civil War, afterwards, all the way up until the Southern realignment, which really kicked in the 80s, and white conservatives started calling themselves Republicans and voting Republicans. So now the fact that it is the Republicans who are the most protective of the Confederate flag and Confederate monuments, even more so than the racial difference, is really a turnabout in history. But it shows these gerrymandered districts which elect the most conservative Republicans are the ones who are making the decisions that aren't even necessarily in line with mainstream Republicans, and they're certainly not in line with the average South Carolinian.
One good thing about Flashpoint, I always love that we can really nerd out on some of these issues that would never make it into a regular newscast because they're just that deep into things. You mentioned before we came on air about how the methodology for the Winthrop poll has changed because of people's habits have changed. And I think it's interesting how you all now have to go about collecting this data in a different way than you did, say, 10 years ago.
Oh, definitely. When I started doing this 20 years ago, nearly everybody had a landline. Whether they had a cell phone or not, they still had a landline. And response rates were incredibly high. So that evolved with more and more people getting cell phones. And we had to start adding in cell phone numbers as well. Now it's down to the point where in South Carolina, only about fewer than 3% are reachable by landline only. Virtually everybody else is reachable by cell phone. Either they only have a cell phone or they have a cell and a landline and their cell mostly. But beyond that, response rates, even for cell phones, are in the low single digits. Now, here's the thing. You look at a Pew or a Gallup, and they mix in a telephone sample as well, and we have done that in the past. We have tended to do that up until now. And the question is, oh my gosh, if only 7% of folks are answering this poll, is it really representative? Thank goodness among that 7%, they're not more likely to be Democrat than Republican. They're not more likely to be male than female compared to people who won't answer the poll. So just like when you go to the physician, you don't give a gallon of blood to get a blood test. You only give a few drops. As long as those few drops of the population are representative, you're still good. But my goodness, it costs so much more, which is why most polling has moved either entirely online or all polling has an online aspect. And there are two ways to do polling online. One is an incredibly well-curated panel that has been created by an entity like YouGov. People will have heard that nationally, where the people are constantly vetted to make sure they are not only representative, but they are legitimately, participating in these surveys. The other way is text to web. So you get a text message saying, this is for a poll, would you like to take it? Response rates for that are low as well, but that is the closest to a true probability sample that we have these days other than calling. Now, when you're calling, that's a probability sample because everybody has an equal chance of being selected for a poll. But their non-probability samples, such as panels, have to be curated very closely, and the closest non-telephone thing we have to a probability sample, again, text to web.
Wow. I'm glad to see at least there's one thing left bipartisan in this country, and that's landlines. Wow, that's so surprising to me. All right, Scott Huffman, professor of politics at Winthrop. Professor, thanks as always. We appreciate it.
Glad to be with you.
All right, more Flashpoint after this.
Welcome back. We're going to get back in a second to breaking down that interview with Professor Huffman, but some other things, of course, I want to mention. North Carolina has a lot going on as well, and this affects both sides of the Carolinas, but those Duke Energy rate hikes that we are waiting for, multiple, but the one that we're really focused on right now is the one that would kick in 2027, could be a potential 18% increase for most households, so not insignificant at all. And so I know this is something that's been on everyone's minds now. Attorney General for the state of North Carolina, Jeff Jackson, is stepping in with a 700-page testimony against it. Ooh. So here's my package from yesterday.
It just doesn't make any sense how high these bills are.
Jamarcus Neal has already taken on extra shifts to combat the rising cost of just living, especially his energy bill.
Tremendously, like $150 more.
Now, North Carolina Attorney General Jeff Jackson is backing up residents like Neal with 700 pages of testimony.
What we did was drill all the way down on what they actually need to meet that growth, and we think they overshot the mark.
He argues this would cost residents nearly $1.4 billion in unnecessary charges over the next 2 years, largely for the corporation's profit. If approved, a typical customer would see an initial increase of about $28 per month starting in 2027, followed by an additional $6 to $7 hike the following year. Duke Energy says the increase is necessary to keep up with growing demand. They say in the past 2 years alone, more than 150,000 new customers have moved into North Carolina.
To help with modernizing our grid, such as self-healing technology that helped avoid 1.2 million customer outages last year.
Jackson's filing also addresses larger energy users like data centers. He says these should be placed in a separate rate class, more reflective of their strain on the power grid.
And going into this new era, we need specific protections to make sure that families don't see rates spike because of gigantic users on the grid.
Well, public opinion and this filing will be taken into consideration.
The cost of living is just not cheap, period. So
the decision lies with the North Carolina Utilities Commission. A verdict is expected this fall. Entirely separate from this, Duke is also requesting an increase in June to cover more than $800 million in lost fuel costs from this winter's weather. In Uptown, Julie Kay, WCNC Charlotte.
So yeah, $28 a month on average, and then an extra $6 to $7 after that. Not insignificant. I think the big thing people are focused on now, though, is of course data centers, which we are waiting to hear what Charlotte City Council is going to do about that on Monday. And then of course there's some legislation going through with some regulations in the General Assembly too. So definitely all very timely right
Yeah,
now. For sure.
and when you think about $20 a month, and then you say times 12, I mean that's a lot of extra money people are expected to come up with.
And people don't want to do it, and that's
Yeah.
I mean not in this economy.
But
as we-
but they also want all their devices powered and everything turned on, and I mean it's a two-way street.
double-edged sword.
All right, so let's talk about what we learned from today's episode. I'll go ahead and go. I think when you look at the numbers, some of the stuff from the Winthrop poll are just staggering. When you say 2/3 of folks in South Carolina say that paying for groceries is difficult, and almost as many saying going out to dinner at this point now is unaffordable, and more than that, 72% saying that a week-long vacation or a week-long trip is now out of the reach for their family. I mean,
That's hard to hear.
that's staggering numbers, you know, and of course this is much more, complicated than just the economy on a national scale or South Carolina or anything like that. But you wonder when politicians hear that, what are they hearing? Because as we said, those are kitchen table pocketbook issues that hit people right in the gut.
And I think that's why a lot of people feel on either side of the aisle disconnected from
Yeah.
lawmakers right now, especially.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, what did you learn?
I think for me, everything in South Carolina goes back to gerrymandering to some
Yeah.
extent, not just this recent failed push that will likely come up again
Yeah.
in the next cycle, but just the historical impact of it. I think it's an interesting, just like history to watch. It's not that South Carolina is by any means alone in that, but they have a particularly interesting history with that, and it just has its hands in so many different aspects of South Carolina politics now.
Yeah. And politics in general. We've been banging that drum on Flashpoint now for
Yeah.
more than a decade. And I know we're not the only ones, but I feel like gerrymandering is the most potent political issue that most people still don't understand.
Which is almost by design.
And it affects everything we do. So glad that he was able to shed a little bit more light on that. All right, folks, that's going to have to do it for this edition of Flashpoint, but we hope to see you back here next week.